Welcome to the First Friday Coffee Break with the Community Indicators Consortium. CIC is a central knowledge and organizational hub for community indicators projects, helping to advance and support measurable, equitable, and sustainable improvements in the quality of community life. I am Marty Romini, Managing Director for CIC, and on the first Friday of each month, we take a short break from our day to learn about the latest projects, data tools, and key issues happening in the world of community indicators. This month, we hear from Quentin Wilson, one of the authors of a new book titled Engagement for Equitable Outcomes, a Practitioner's Playbook. In our coffee break, Quentin discusses the purpose for writing the book and the development of the Data and Engagement for Equitable Measurable Outcomes, or DEMOS framework. He also discusses the relevance of the framework to Community Indicators Consortium members, as engagement and measures, feelings and figures are key to the framework and ultimately for better community outcomes. Thank you again for tuning in to this month's CIC Coffee Break.
My name is Quentin Wilson, and I appreciate this opportunity to present to the Community Indicators Consortium. I am a former government employee. I've worked in the public sector, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector, in each case having a mission of improving conditions, quality of life, and performance in these sectors. There are a lot of similarities between them. In each case, especially today, there seems to be a common interest in social impact. How are we affecting the quality of life in communities? And I hope to apply the experiences I've had to help communities, to help you, and to work with you in improving your efforts to achieve results. To do so, after a long career as practitioner, I began working on a book with some other co-authors, and I'd like to talk to you about that today, to talk to you both about what we developed and the questions we raised in coming up with that approach. We're talking today about a new book that has come out and some discoveries we made there that we think can help you in the work you do. And we'd really like to have you engage in this work and help lead forward to answer the questions that we've come up with. And so the book, we're a little pitch for the book, but with a discount for members of Community Indicators Consortium. This just came out last week, and you're the first audience of community members really to learn this and learn what we're talking about. So with the next slide, we'll give you some contact information for the book. Then let's talk about what we really discovered in this effort with the next slide. First, one of the things we discovered, and this was the core purpose of the book, we wanted to simplify the tools available for performance improvement. There are lots of initiatives and strategies and approaches for performance improvement in social impact, in communities, in states, in the country. Many of them are very challenging to implement, to sustain. What we came up with was a different framing of these, a process framing that we think includes some of the best tools that any system of performance improvement is using, but applies them in a process that we think will get better results for communities. That was the core purpose of this book. So we had these, on the left side, our engagement for equitable outcomes model. We had 5 parts: engaging people in establishing and prioritizing outcomes. The second step was researching, identifying, and developing interventions. Try to figure out what might solve problems, whether we're doing a new intervention or just trying to replicate something that has already been a promising or proven program in some other community. The third step was to take these promising interventions and to adapt them, to implement them in individual communities. Every community is different, and there are many tools for that, and that's such an important step. The fourth step is scaling interventions for maximum impact. And the fifth step was sustaining and improving this effort over time to continuously improve work in the communities. And these 5 steps are not brand new to anybody. They just are a different way of framing dozens and dozens of approaches to community performance improvement, to transformation in performance, whether it's in government, in the community organizations, or in private sector social impact. We think it affects all those. And that was the core purpose of the book. And we'll talk a little bit about these more on the next slide, about how they relate to each other. So the first step, outcomes, there's a lot of managing for results efforts. And the first step was inclusively collaborating to prioritize equitable outcomes. That is a key step that really isn't always undertaken at the beginning of a process. And there are 2 parts of that. One is being outcomes driven, and the other piece is to be engaging with the community in determining those outcomes, both the ones you want to achieve and those you'll evaluate success against. The second step here was identifying and developing promising interventions. That's where, whether you're working with universities or other research institutions, or you're looking at the numerous What Works clearinghouses, one of the things we found in our research was there are hundreds of promising interventions out there. Many of them are never replicated. That's what we'd like to overcome. We'd like to take those promising interventions that may have been thoroughly evaluated in a particular location, but just never got replicated beyond that one community. The next step really drove this work, and it was a frustration with implementation. It was so difficult, even with a great program, to take it into another community and implement it. We think the most important aspect of customization that can occur there is adapting to the particular needs of the end users in those communities. So who are you trying to serve? That's another form of engagement. Bring them in to try to improve that program or policy or product that you're hoping to deliver in your communities. And if you're the Community Indicators Consortium member, work with the participants in your alliance, in your community group to do this. The fourth step is really challenging, rarely seen. It may be a unicorn to some, and that is scaling interventions. Why are there so many interventions out there that don't get brought to scale, do not get brought nationwide, have such a potential for improvement? Things you may have worked on in your community, and you're wondering, why isn't the community on the other side of the state doing this? Or even our community 6 miles away doing this? We feel like the engagement, the first 3 steps we talked about, engagement in these processes, will help lead to scaling. And then the final step is one that's more commonly understood as in any performance improvement effort, and that is to sustain it, to continuously improve what you're doing. Much of what is described as performance improvement falls into that category. It's very important. It's got to be done. But we think with these other 4 steps and that, there's going to be a bigger impact. There's going to be more radical innovation and transformation. And that's really the core of what our book was about, these 5 steps. We thought that was something to achieve. And we presented to the federal government after the government said you could do presentations on equity again. And every step, as you can see, has inclusive participation, not just community leaders, but community members. And we had a presentation, including the Government Accountability Office and 200 folks from different federal agencies, and presented this, and they're all like, well, this is interesting. There's a lot of good involvement and discussion. Somebody asked, how is this different from any other performance improvement model? And I thought, that's a pretty good question. It's not really different. It's a different framing of hundreds of tools that are already out there. So we think it's useful to think about everything in terms of these 5 steps. And I was trying to think on my feet with this question, and said there is one difference we noted. that at every one of these 5 steps, the most effective approach in those 5 areas involve both engagement of the community members, not just the leaders, not just the experts, but community members, those who you intend to benefit with this effort. And the second part was outcomes and measures. Community Indicators Consortium folks know clearly about the benefit of the outcomes and measures. But the engagement piece, there's a whole separate world, Braver Angels and other organizations working on engagement. But separately, they don't have the impact that we believe they could have together. So the next step in our process is something we're calling E plus M equals C squared. Engagement plus measures equals community change. It's another research project, but in this one, we'd like to have you involved in creating an integrated system where figures and feelings both matter. And to give attribution, the chief statistician at OECD came up with that figures and feelings expression several years ago, and very, very much a data and evidence-oriented person, but she realized that feelings and understanding the emotional aspect of what you're trying to achieve is another form of evidence and information. And you just don't find these two together. As I said before, you don't find them together all the time. They both matter. People even at high level political challenges, it seems like there's a debate sometimes centering around this. The evidence says this. Yeah, but I feel this. How do we bring those together? And that's what we're trying to figure out. I'd like to work with Community Indicators Consortium, to which I belong, in trying to develop that if you're that kind of organization. Our mission is to develop a more effective system of promising performance improvement tools and practices for engaging all types of community members and other stakeholders. It might be a company that is based in that community to prioritize and achieve results. So every one of those 5 steps, have people engage in that process. And then we think it's more likely that the original model we came up with will be successfully implemented. You're going to develop improvement efforts. You're going to implement them, scale them, sustain them, and continuously improve them. That's what we're trying to achieve. It wasn't the original purpose of our book. We're very happy and proud of our book, but there's a lot more work to be done. So let me talk about our strategy and how we're going to achieve that mission. We have a 3-part strategy for this. We're going to evaluate promising engagement approaches, tools, and resources. What's happening in your communities? Elsewhere around the country, our programs for engagement, trying to bridge political divides. We want to evaluate the best and really to try to understand what's the best way to engage a vast number of community members. There are likely to be technology solutions or approaches that we ought to utilize. There are efforts like Cortico at MIT, Bang the Table, and Connect the Dots, different startup companies trying to get community insights. So we'll find the best of that. We'll also assess the impact of systems for measuring outcomes. We've got a group of researchers right now working, some of them with some members of the Community Indicators Consortium, about their measurement and outcome system to determine the impact of it. How did it help you focus on a particular issue area? Did it help achieve results? And the third piece was to try to evaluate the interaction. How do these work together? Could engagement be used, for example, to prioritize outcomes, to make sure you're talking to community members, the largest number, not just a representative sample, but actual community members in their own words to understand what they want. One of the challenges of this kind of work, and I'm sure many of you have experienced it, is many community members have survey fatigue. We're not talking about feedback and a survey after action. We're talking about upfront connection. And many community members have told us in some of this pilot work that they've been surveyed a lot. What are you going to do about it? Nothing ever happens. That's something that our 5-part model, we think, can tackle. But the most important step, we think, in getting there is this broad and diverse engagement, equitable engagement, generating the idea about outcomes that matter to the whole community. And that's this third step. So if we can do this, we will be answering some questions that were raised in the book. The book has a great model. We think is going to be valuable, that 5-part model. But the most important part for us is going to be, how do you really bring people, engage people together in this effort to try to measure the goals you have and the impact of your work on these goals? We think if we can work together on a system like that, we'll get the full benefit from all these efforts around the country and the world to improve communities. So if you're interested and willing to participate with us, we'd like you to contact us. It would be great to hear your insights and folks that you might or research you think we ought to pay attention to. Also, if you have any questions about this approach, please contact me or Marty Remedy directly about this. We'd love to work with you. We'd love to have your insights. And I think we'd like to walk the talk. We'd like to have the kind of engagement with you that we think will co-create a system that can be used by communities everywhere.